Welcome to the Where Data Meets Business podcast, in which we discuss how data driven approaches can help you achieve business outcomes bigger, better, faster. I'm Sonia Ketkar, a former academic and researcher, current consultant, and forever New Yorker. In today's episode, we're going to cover a very important topic that is fundamental to every business and every industry: pricing. More specifically, we're going to dig deeper into dynamic pricing, which is much more common today with technology companies like Uber, Lyft, and Amazon, among others, using it to align revenue opportunities with customer demand. So, I'm delighted to introduce my guest today, Bob Phillips. Bob is currently an independent consultant and author specializing in the application of data science to business. Previously, he was CEO of Decision Focus Incorporated, which pioneered the development of dynamic pricing and revenue management to airlines, hotels, rental cars, and many other industries. He's also the founder of Nomis Solutions that provides dynamic pricing software to financial service companies. More recently, he has served as head of marketplace data science for Uber and pricing data science at Amazon. He has taught courses at the MBA, Master's, and PhD levels at Stanford University and Columbia University Business Schools. He's written 2 books on pricing and revenue management and co-edited the Oxford Handbook of Pricing Management. On a personal note, I had the privilege to work with Bob last year. I learned a lot from him, and I'm sure you will do too. Bob, thank you for being here and welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Sonia, and thank you for the great introduction.
So to bring everyone on the same page, this is how I usually kind of start off with the description or of the concept that we're going to talk about today, dynamic pricing. So how would you define dynamic pricing?
That's a great question. I don't know if people know, but Oxford University Press just named dynamic pricing as runner-up for Word of the Year for 2024, even though it's actually 2 words. In case you're wondering, the winning word, which is also 2 words, was brain rot. So it's definitely something that's been in the news a lot lately and generating a lot of interest. I can start with the Oxford way that Oxford defines it. They define it as, quote, dynamic pricing is the practice of varying the price for a product or service to reflect changing market conditions, and particularly the charging of a higher price at a time of greater demand, unquote. I think that's pretty good, although to me, dynamic pricing is just as much about lowering prices as well as raising them. While we're on definitions, I do want to stress that dynamic pricing is very different from personalized pricing, which means charging different prices to different customers at the same time. I see these often confused in the press. People talk about, I think they're doing dynamic pricing because they're charging different prices to her than they are charging to me, but that's not dynamic pricing. Dynamic pricing, personalized pricing is about charging different prices at the same time. And the topic of this webcast is dynamic pricing, which is about changing prices over time.
Yeah, and for all our listeners, I'm really glad that you mentioned the fact that it could also be about lowering prices because, I think that's where a lot of people get confused. So as I mentioned in your introduction, you are a pioneer in the development of dynamic pricing. So can you take us back to the start and just share a little bit more about how it evolved for the airlines, hotels, and other industries at the time?
Sure. I think the airlines were some of the most important drivers of the early development of dynamic pricing, which was then called yield management or revenue management. Drifting way back to 1978, airline pricing in the United States and pretty much everywhere else, maybe everywhere else, was fully regulated prior to 1978. In order to change a price, an airline had to file a petition with the government and have the change approved by the federal government, which did not grant many changes, especially to large airlines. So it's a pretty static pricing environment. In 1978, the U.S. government instituted a Big Bang deregulation, as it's called, of the airline industry, which enabled airlines to have suddenly, virtually overnight, complete flexibility in scheduling, routing, and pricing. Now, maybe not surprisingly, given the regulatory environment they'd been working under, the legacy carriers were not very well prepared for the freedom of this new world, and they were blindsided when low-cost carriers such as People Express and Southwest emerged with far lower costs in the early 1980s. The so-called legacy carriers, the carriers that had been around prior to deregulation, such as American, United, and Delta, were saddled with much higher costs because they had union contracts and they had these fleets of many different types of aircraft. And they couldn't survive if they had to sell their seats at the same rates as the new discount carriers. American Airlines is usually credited with coming up with a basic idea behind dynamic pricing, initially offering low fares that match their low-cost competitors, but limiting how many seats they sold at those fares so that some seats on each flight could be reserved for higher-paying customers who book later. Analytics were used to forecast demand for the different types of customers and to determine how many seats should be saved for the late-booking, high-paying customers to maximize revenue. This was the genesis of revenue management, and to the customers, it looked like dynamic pricing because people figured out pretty soon, well, prices would be low, and then at some point they went up. And as things got more sophisticated, they would go up several times, potentially over time. Then they might go back down if the airlines anticipated that the flight was not going to sell out. So people got used to the fact, whether they liked it or not, that airline prices be dynamic. The strategy proved to be enormously successful and allowed the legacy carriers to compete effectively with the low-cost upstarts while they realized higher overall average fares. In fact, that once rapidly growing low-cost carrier, People Express, was effectively driven out of business by superior revenue management on the part of other carriers. The practice of revenue management spread to all major carriers, and as their markets were increasingly deregulated, carriers in Europe and Asia also adopted the practice, which is now worldwide, I think, pretty much universal among airlines. Following success in the airline industry, similar industries that had this constrained perishable capacity, such as hotels, cruise lines, and rental cars, began exploring the application of revenue management in the late 80s. It is now, I'd say, pretty ubiquitous in these industries, as well as spreading to freight and cargo-related industries as well.
Got it. So it seems like it was very transformative for airlines, hotels, and some of the others back in the day. Change isn't easy for pretty much anyone. So what were some of the challenges, in implementing this new system in those industries at the time from a business perspective? And was there any kind of organizational resistance to change?
Yeah. Depending upon the industry, there were different levels of resistance. In the airlines, it became increasingly clear over time that the airlines who had implemented dynamic pricing were outperforming those that hadn't. It became apparent that this was a critical business capability. And within a couple of years, you had, a sell-side, buy-side analysts asking airlines about their revenue management capabilities on the earnings calls. So that was a big turning point because airlines realized, it's not just something that's internal, but it's something the external world is looking about and expects as kind of a core capability. That was a really great motivator to adopt revenue management. In other industries, there are different levels of resistance. Whenever there's a long existing way of doing business, Sonia, there's going to be internal resistance to change, I think, just as you were implying. Esther, most companies that have been around for a while are, I'd say, quote, good enough at pricing. Otherwise, they wouldn't survive as long as they have. Convincing them that they should change their long-held approaches is often met with skepticism, particularly when it comes from outsiders. And since I was a consultant, in these cases, I was coming from outside the organization to try to help them institute dynamic pricing or revenue management. I was working with a team that was seeking to introduce dynamic pricing for the first time in the American less than truckload trucking industry, which is kind of a notoriously conservative industry, as you can imagine. And many of the executives I was talking to had come up from working in the field, and they were pretty skeptical of changes. So when our team proposed new ways of pricing, their reactions, which I have to say they weren't shy to express to us, were a lot along the lines of, you guys may have college degrees, but you've never worked on a cross-dock facility at 20 degrees below zero when you can't feel your fingers and you're trying to load a 48-foot trailer on a tight schedule for departure. What makes you think you can tell us how to do our business? And as you can imagine, it required considerable extra effort to implement systems successfully in the face of this kind of resistance.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting how when you started talking about this organizational change and resistance, you mentioned the fact that they were facing a lot of pressure on earnings calls to, kind of talk about that transformation. And so that kind of pressure sort of is similar to what companies are going through right now in the case of AI and so on. It's almost like an expectation that you're going to look for, ways to bring AI into your systems and transform it. So I think it's so many historical lessons from that time as well. And I want to kind of move forward a little bit from that era to more of the technology era, if you were to call it that. So fast forwarding to these more recent times, how was this experience different, at Uber and Amazon, where you also spent a lot of time?
Yeah, it was pretty much night and day, a really enormous difference. Most tech companies like Uber and Amazon that you mentioned, and most companies founded within, say, the last 20 to 30 years, have analytics in their DNA, which is kind of a Silicon Valley cliche, but really does capture a core truth that these companies take it for granted that the way to make most business decisions, and I'm not just talking about pricing, is through the use of analytics applied to data. So, for one thing, these businesses, since they're new, didn't have entrenched processes that might resist disruption. But more importantly, leaders from the top on down in a lot of these companies believe in the power of analytics for business decisions, I think particularly at internet scale. So when Amazon started selling large numbers of books, Jeff Bezos didn't say, oh my gosh, we're selling lots of books. We need to get hire a lot of experienced bookstore owners and tell us how to forecast demand, order inventory, and set prices. Rather, they hired data scientists and software engineers who could develop and implement algorithms that could do it efficiently at scale. Same with Uber and Lyft. When they started growing, they didn't say, oh, we have to hire a lot of former taxi drivers to tell us how to do pricing and run our business. They hired data scientists to build routing and pricing functions. This, of course, makes it much easier because you don't have to spend your time and effort in these companies selling the idea of analytics internally. They're already sold from the top on down. Rather, you can invest time and effort in building and testing better approaches and algorithms. I'd also say it's much easier to test new approaches to pricing in internet-based companies. Jeff Bezos has gone on record saying that, quote, to invent, you have to experiment. And if you know in advance that it's not going to work, it's not an experiment, unquote. So both at Uber and Amazon, my team set up online platforms that enabled the companies to test dynamic pricing enhancements, different ways of doing dynamic pricing. This made it much easier to evolve pricing systems based on the real world observations and not offline simulations or pencil and paper analyses or people arguing in a room what they think might be the best approach.
Yeah, so definitely a different world from what it was back then with the airlines and hotels and so on. With more enterprise AI solutions launching in the market every day, do you think that AI adoption inside organizations will have parallels to the Uber, Amazon analytics in their DNA example or the trucking one? Or do you think we'll see a divide between the current technology and non-technology sectors?
Well, I think as in the past, this is going to be a journey, and there's going to be early adopters, fast followers, and laggards. However, in many industries, even now, algorithmic dynamic pricing is such a clear advantage, it will be table stakes for entry. I mean, I can't conceive of a new rideshare company or an online retailer operating at scale without some sort of data and analytics-driven dynamic pricing. Other industries with less scale, less need to change prices as quickly, are likely to be slower to adopt. And it's not necessarily a divide between tech and non-tech. Walmart has been very advanced in their online dynamic pricing, and they would not, at least historically, be considered a tech company. However, they did acquire a pretty sophisticated dynamic pricing capability when they purchased Jet.com some time ago. So it's noticeable that other classic offline retailers, I would say with the exception of Target, have really struggled to be as successful online. And I think it's somewhat the slowness to adopt things like dynamic pricing that has hindered them from breaking in to online retail as successfully, despite having very established brand names.
Yeah. So I wanted to, for some of the more technical listeners, I wanted to get into methodology for a few minutes. How do you develop dynamic pricing models? I mean, what kind of data do you need? What's the first step?
I sort of think of it as kind of the other way around. I don't think about, well, we have algorithm, what data do we need for it? I start with a very practical assessment of the business. What is possible given the constraints around the frequency with which pricing can be updated? What information will be available at the time of decision making? So, for example, at Amazon, we had very good real-time competitive price information. At Uber, we basically had none at the time we needed to set the price. This really shaped the systems that we built that are very different at Uber and Amazon for dynamic pricing, although they both do dynamic pricing. The question I would ask is, given the information available, what can we build or what can you build that can deliver benefits most quickly? I think that most successful dynamic pricing projects are incremental to some degree. Prove the concept, do what you can with the data you have, gather more data, improve the algorithms. And, that's sort of an iterative process, which is opposed to trying to boil the ocean by committing to build the ultimate system right off the bat. Again, a lot depends on the level of commitment of senior management, the extent to which dynamic pricing is already accepted within the organization, and the readiness of the organization to embrace change. So the data, once we've done that, go back and look at the data that we need. That's dependent on the industry. So for the first airline systems, the critical data was historical sales and flight capacity. We used historical sales to determine whether or not we expected a flight to reach capacity, and then the systems would raise or lower prices accordingly. At that time, we did not have up-to-date competitive pricing data, so very much dependent on our forecast. We have a flight with 200 empty seats leaving in a week. Given our current prices, do we forecast total demand will be 250, in which case we should raise the price a bit to dampen the demand? Or do we think it'll be 150, in which case we might want to lower the price so we attract more demand so we fill the seats? At Uber, the critical factor is the supply-demand balance at any time in a city. If the current and immediately predicted demand exceeds the number of drivers available, we may need to raise the price, and of course, vice versa. At Amazon, the primary factor in pricing is, in most cases, competitive price. Amazon accesses the price of both physical and online competitors' stores in order to set their price, and they typically want to be at or below the prices being offered by key competitors. So I think the answer, Sonia, is it depends. In many cases, it's useful to understand how customers respond to our prices, i.e. price elasticity, which is something we needed at Uber to know how much do we raise the price in order so we can dampen the demand so it comes in and we have enough supply to satisfy it. And in order to do that, we often need price testing or experimentation to generate the variation in prices and demands needed to measure elasticity. In other cases, particularly when capacity is perishable, demand and sales forecasts will be critical, in which case a demand forecasting system would be required.
Super interesting. So on this topic of methodology, I read an article in Forbes recently that said, and I'm going to quote this, the use of AI not only increases the efficiency of price adjustments, but also introduces a level of precision that was previously unattainable with manual analysis. Close quote. Would you agree with that statement?
Well, it's in Forbes, so it must be true. No, I would think if you replace AI with analytic dynamic pricing, I would certainly agree, with the caveat that I find precision a bit of a fuzzy word. Data-driven dynamic pricing enables sales, inventories, and competitive prices to be tracked 24/7 in a way that would be difficult or impossible for humans to achieve. The first gain is simply to be able to respond very quickly when you see a competitive price change or your inventory is getting low. So even if the response isn't perfect, with dynamic pricing, if you're monitoring these situations and adjusting your prices, it's definitely better waiting till a person wakes up in the morning, has their cup of coffee, and looks at it maybe 8 hours later to recognize the new situation and generate a response. Of course, algorithmic pricings are generally prices are generally more precise, but I think the timeliness of responses they provide is equally important.
What a fast-moving world we live in today. Just overall. Um, so, sort of continuing on this methodology train, what pitfalls should analysts try to avoid when they're developing pricing models? Like, what could possibly go wrong?
Oh, there's a lot that could go wrong, and there are plenty of pitfalls. And I should know because I'm sure I've fallen into almost all of them at one time or another. The first thing is that to make sure you have full management support before proceeding, especially if you are introducing dynamic pricing or any analytic approach to our organization for the first time. As I noted before, if you're displacing or supplementing an existing human-driven process, you can anticipate lots of pushback. If you don't have full management support at the appropriate level, there's a resist that whatever you implement is going to be rejected, like a bad kidney. The second pitfall is not understanding the business sufficiently well before proceeding. When starting in a new industry, I insist that the team spend at least a week in a deep dive into the business so we can all gain sufficient domain knowledge. Pricing touches all aspects of the business. Everybody has an interest in it. Sales, marketing, finance. Everybody has an opinion about pricing. Everybody has something to contribute. So we need to understand how it impacts at all these different levels in these different organizations. When I did start working in freight, I mentioned LTL Freight before. I spent a day visiting terminals and traveled 200 miles to visit a break bulk facility. I also sat in a car for a full day with a salesperson as he made his rounds in the territory. I actually had a stack of pies in my lap because what he would do is take a pie to the particular buyers who are buying freight services. So at Uber, I spent most of the week as an Uber driver and insisted all members of my team do so as well. If you don't understand how a business operates, you risk making major mistakes that could derail the project. So, for example, when we're doing pricing at Uber, it's absolutely critically important to know how does a driver interact with those particular prices, the surge prices that they see. How much information can you give them without distracting them? And the way to think about that is just to do it. So that was really important. Last, but certainly not least, a major pitfall is underestimating the time you're going to spend on data cleansing and reconciliation, particularly when you're introducing dynamic pricing for the first time to an industry or a company. In many cases, you're going to be looking at data at a level of detail that has not previously been considered, and you're going to uncover a lot of unsuspected glitches. This is particularly true when you begin to merge data from different sources. So, classically in a lot of industries, you're merging occupancy data with arrival and departure data that maybe have never been reconciled before. So a reasonable rule of thumb is to expect dealing with data issues to take about a third of project resources. If you work with a company that promises you that their data is perfect, then you should plan for it to take about a half of your project resources because it never is perfect. And that just means they don't understand their data in most cases.
Oh, interesting. I'm also curious, what was it like being an Uber driver for a week?
It gave me great respect for Uber drivers because there's a lot of processing you have to do between looking at the app and seeing where the surge is when the rides come in. Also paying attention, you don't want to rear end somebody or get in an accident, and then thinking about where should I drive when I don't have any passengers, dealing with passengers and being nice to them and pulling over the curb and looking for the passenger. It's I think it can be a great job, but it has a lot of skills and requires a lot of mental agility.
Yeah, I can imagine. I haven't done it before, but maybe at some point,
Sonia,
just to get the experience, I'd have to buy a car first. So there's
it may not be worth it to buy a car just to do
it. Right, big step in the way and a big expense. Anyway, so in addition to being the runner-up for Word of the Year for 2024, dynamic pricing has also been in the news lately, and not necessarily in a good way, with complaints about high prices for Bruce Springsteen, Oasis, Taylor Swift, etc. events. So how important do you think is customer acceptance in instituting dynamic pricing?
That's a great question. A couple of thoughts. First of all, customers tend to be quite conservative in the sense that they're suspicious of any changes in the way that prices are set. So they typically may get upset when the business that's had static prices switches over to dynamic prices. They figure that dynamic pricing is going to be a way to extract more money through them through higher prices. And of course, all the cases you read about in the papers, the ones you met, Bruce Springsteen, Taylor Swift, I think you mentioned Oasis, it's people getting upset about higher prices. They're not really that upset about dynamic prices. They're upset that they may have to pay a very high price. So that's the case that causes outrage. If in most dynamic pricing implementations, prices are lowered as often as they're raised. During my tenure at Amazon, dynamic prices went up and down over time, but our internal study and some external research that was done by academics showed that the general area across all prices was downward over time. And I've got to say, this is prior to COVID and inflation. And it's kind of intuitive when you think about it. Looking across everything in the store, for every upward adjustment, there tended to be more downward adjustments as items moved along their product life cycle and became obsolete, like game versions, television sets, fashion goods. And as more competition would come in after a good was introduced, it would tend to drive the price down too. On the other hand, ticket prices for performances to a lesser extent sporting events have the issues that purchasers have this expectation that the performer or the team should treat them fairly. They feel, particularly you read about this in the case of Bruce Springsteen, they feel this personal connection to the performer. And then when they see Bruce Springsteen tickets being sold at $2,000 or $5,000, I forget what the top price was, they feel personally betrayed by the performer. Prior to dynamic pricing, the initial prices for different popular performers was typically quite a bit lower than the market clearing price, and the difference was a source of profit for scalpers, of course. Thus, for a Bruce Springsteen ticket concert, a scalper might buy a ticket for $200 and sell it for $2,000. This, however, seemed to cause less anger among fans than when the ticket was originally priced at $2,000, even though in either case they'd have to pay $2,000 to get it. But they personally resent the fact that it was Bruce himself, although it really isn't Bruce himself, but they associate it with Bruce himself trying to take advantage with him rather than some stranger who is selling it for $2,000. At the end of the day, I think in all the industries where it makes sense, dynamic pricing is going to be applied, at least to some extent. The rewards are just too great to ignore. In some cases, there's going to be consumer resistance. Back in the 1980s, when we were building the first revenue management systems, consumers were grumbling about changing fare for airline seats and why did the guy sitting next to me pay less for the same seat. But over time, consumers have by and large accepted that that's the way it goes for airlines. Dynamic pricing is the norm. People have also accepted that large online sellers like Amazon and Walmart have dynamic prices. If you look at the price of an item today and you look tomorrow, it might be a different price, might be higher, might be lower. However, as the concert ticket concerns have shown, new industries introducing dynamic price need to be careful, and they should be sensitive to potential customer concerns, but they shouldn't let initial customer resistance entirely dissuade them.
Yeah, it's the whole, managing consumer expectations or just their perceptions just seems like that is one more dimension of any kind of transformation that a company undergoes inside, because it's such a big part of how it's going to be, how people are going to respond to it. So I've saw that previously as well in the various, brands that I've interacted with before. It's always like the outsider doesn't know what's going on inside, and they just immediately blame, in this case, the artist, as you pointed out, with Bruce or Taylor or any of the others. So you seem to have done it all, including entrepreneurship. So we talked about, I talked about some of the startups that you've worked with or founded in your introduction. So what led you down the path of entrepreneurship to start your own companies?
Well, the first company that was one I had not founded, but I was a CEO, had been acquired by a public company. And after about a year, I was ready for something new. So I spent a little time as a visiting professor at Columbia University, but a former colleague of mine, Simon Caulfield, had a background in banking and financial services. And he and I both believed that financial services was an excellent target for dynamic pricing. There was plenty of data available. They believed in analytics, and there wasn't anybody else at that time working in the space. So we founded Noma Solutions. After signing a few early customers, we went and negotiated some venture capital funding, enabled us to build the first version of our first product. While I left the company a while ago, it's still going strong, and I remain on the board of directors. I loved it. It was one of the most exciting and fun things I've ever done is starting a company. I don't think that the path is for everyone. You have to accept an enormous level of effort and stress. Simon and I were kind of all in. We didn't really have a plan B, and we're fortunate it worked out well enough that we didn't have to worry about plan B. But I found it personally extremely enjoyable and ultimately rewarding. So glad I did it.
So you would do it again?
Maybe. I don't know if I have that level of passion and energy and willingness to work, 60 to 80 hours a week that I had back then. But if I found something I was super passionate about, sure.
Yeah. It's definitely hard work. So now that you're advising other startups, what kind of work do these startups do? What's the latest?
Well, there's a variety of businesses. Some are still in stealth mode, but the common, which is a phrase I hate, but it obligates me not to say exactly who they are or what they're doing. But a common factor is the use of AI and business analytics to make better decisions. One of the companies, Cargo Robotics, are automating the last mile with a robotic system that would fit on delivery vans and make picking the packages easier. This involves optimization and AI to make sure that delivery is efficient as possible. I'm advising a company called EasyPie that is looking to provide sort of the TaskRabbit for people doing data science tasks. So if you have a data science task, analytics, or AI task, but you don't have an AI staff, don't want to build one up, you can put it on the platform and find somebody who can do the task for you. I also continue to work with Noma Solutions on helping them provide optimal prices for financial services.
Oh, great. Interesting. Definitely going to see a lot more of the AI-driven, platforms and companies out there in the future. So what else are you working on right now?
Well, aside from this consulting and advising different companies, I am writing a book on online pricing experimentations. So if you think about it, and kind of going back to Jeff Bezos's quote about the importance of experimentation, online sales is perfectly set up for experimentation. You can change prices or anything else quickly and cheaply, and you see how customers respond. And this is, kind of in contrast to brick and mortar stores where it takes time and is costly. I heard one estimate at one store, it costs them 15 cents every time they change a price. You have to change the price tag, reprogram all of the computer systems. And so online, though, you can basically do it for cheap, but the cost is really just the cost of the electrons when you change the price. And this allows you to make better fact-based decisions on pricing and pricing policies. However, one of the things I found is that the way that statistics is often taught, particularly at MBA, but not just in MBA courses, it is not really effective in teaching people how to deal with these large-scale, high-speed experiments and how you can design, execute, and evaluate pricing decisions and pricing experiments most efficiently. So I'd like to put what I've learned through Uber and Amazon and some other consulting I've done, along with the literature, in a single place so that people are going to be running experiments and the people evaluating and making decisions based on results can have a source that can help make sure they do it in the most accurate fashion.
Oh, that's going to be a great contribution. We look forward to it. And on that note of sharing knowledge, do you have any advice or recommendations of books, courses, etc., for folks who are looking to build careers in pricing or dynamic pricing?
Well, I guess I have to recommend my own book, Pricing and Revenue Optimization. It's written at the advanced undergraduate and MBA level and used a textbook at a number of different business schools, I think about 20 or so. I also I have taught an online course through Columbia Business School that's available called Pricing Methodologies, where I cover dynamic pricing, among other topics, go into some depth on it. And then another book that I could recommend, it does not focus on dynamic pricing, but it's kind of good basic text on the strategic aspects of pricing, is The Strategy and Tactics of Pricing by Muller, Nagel, and Holden.
Got it. So for everyone listening, I will include links to Bob's books and any other sources that are discussed today in the show notes and the newsletter as well. Bob, this was such a great conversation. Thank you for being with us today.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Sonia. Thank you for having me. Always love to talk about this topic.
Great. And to our audience, if you'd like to stay connected with us, please share and subscribe to this channel. You can also sign up to our newsletter, databusiness.substack.com. See you next time.
Bye.